So I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government. It's great to see such a large turnout. I don't know if we have enough food. I know that's always a huge attraction for students. And we do have some chairs up here if people are short. Chairs, not easy to get to, but as best you can, maybe try to pull some of those out. I do want to recognize today, we're very fortunate. The topic of the seminar today is the future of the international monetary system, the dollar versus the yuan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Close enough?
You'll pass.
I certainly am not a China expert per se. And we have three people. Edo Campanella is going to moderate the discussion. Edo is a senior global economist at UniCredit, but more importantly, from our perspective, is he has been a senior fellow here at the center for 4 years, 3 years, something like that, for a while. And then we also have Jeffrey Frankel, who is a long-standing faculty member here at the Kennedy School, clearly expertise in international monetary policy, and just generally more broadly, a great macroeconomist. He has been at the Council of Economic Advisors multiple times here in the US, particularly during the Clinton administration. And he can fill you in more on that if you have questions for him. And then we have Meg Rithmire from the business school. She's going to be embarrassed when I do this, but I think she deserves a round of applause because she just was awarded tenure at HBS. So. And she holds a PhD in government from Harvard, and her primary expertise is really on China. In particular, she's had two books that are I think quite noteworthy. The first is Land Bargains in Chinese Capitalism, and that was in 2015. And she just has a new book out, which is terrific, called Precarious Ties, Business and the State in Authoritarian Asia. And it's really investigating the relationship between capital and the state and globalization in China, Malaysia, and Indonesia from the early 1980s to the present. So obviously another timely topic. So we have two fantastic experts, one on international policy, international monetary policy, and one on China, with a big overlap into economics in general. So thank you, and Edo, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, John, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this panel on the future of the international monetary system that is very much related to an article that Meg and I have just completed for the Carnegie Endowment, and it will be part of a report that will be published in a few weeks. Our discussion will not be about our paper, and hopefully so for you, but the purpose of this conversation is to bring some clarity about the future of a monetary system, because we believe that the debate is often biased and superficial. There is a tendency to believe that great powers have great currencies, and that's why people, especially in Washington, are very concerned right now about the rise of China and the potential for the renminbi to displace the dollar. But in reality, hard power and currency power don't coincide for two reasons. Global currencies tend to be locked in, tend to be sticky, because there are network externalities, and so they tend to outlive the power that issue them. At the same time, for a new currency to become a global currency, it needs to gain the trust of international investors. And this is something that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, especially when there are deficiencies in terms of institutional, macroeconomic and financial environment. So that's why we will take the long view in our conversation. We will look at how the international monetary system will evolve over the next 10 years, assuming that the dollar dominance is not under threat right now. But before we get there, I think, Jeffrey, it might be useful if you can give us a snapshot of how the international monetary system is structured right now, and whether there are potential rivals for the dollar in the current context.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to take on the entire international monetary system, but focus on the role of the dollar and its rivals for the status of international currency. There's a number of international currencies defined as currencies that are used outside of their home country. And the dollar has been the reigning top currency for quite some time, but there is discussion increasing again lately about the possibility that that will go away. Because there are many measures of international currency use, reserve holdings, vehicle currency, denomination of trade, invoicing of trade, and denomination of financial movements. Basically, the international versions of store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. The characteristics that suit a currency for being one of the leading international currencies. Let me go through them and say how the leading candidates seem to qualify or don't. Number one is the size of the home economy of the country that issues the currency. And not long ago, we thought that Eurozone would be catching up with the US in economic size, and China would certainly be catching up with the US in economic size. But if you compare GDPs at current exchange rates, it hasn't happened, and it might even not happen. That's been a pretty radical shift. It didn't happen all at once, but it's really come over the last few years in the case of China as it slows down its growth rate. And in the case of the euro, maybe as when Britain and Sweden decided not to join. And growth in Europe has been just slower than the US. So the dollar is still clearly number one by size criterion. Number two is the financial markets that are the home of the currency. They need to be deep, liquid, open. So the US has New York and the rest of the US financial system, and it is clearly number one by that criterion. The euro is well behind, and renminbi is even farther behind. I won't talk about the lesser currencies. Pound sterling is long punched above its weight, in part because of the city of London, and the yen is on the list, and then some smaller ones. So by criterion one, size of country, criterion two, depth of financial markets. Criterion three is ability to hold value as opposed to indiscriminately exploiting the exorbitant privilege, running deficits, printing too much money, resulting in a depreciation of the currency against foreign other currencies and an increase in inflation. When the Bretton Woods system ended in 1971, the US had high inflation and deficits, and it sort of seemed like the US was neglecting its role. It seemed to the Europeans that the US was neglecting its role to provide a stable store of value, and that started the talk about maybe the Deutschmark will take over, and then maybe the yen will take over. But the dollar has maintained its value, notwithstanding a bout of inflation that we hopefully are past, and so has the renminbi, despite some recent depreciation, and the euro. And then the final thing that's benefiting the dollar is simple inertia. As Edoardo mentioned, there's network externalities. People use the dollar because everyone else uses the dollar. So people speak English because everyone else speaks English when they're not speaking their native language. That's entrenched. That will last even if the fundamentals do change. So the recent statistics all show, by the various measures, all show the dollar still a number one position. The Federal Reserve has calculated a weighted average of all the various different measures. Who you choose to peg your currency to is another measure. There's quite a few. By the Fed's measure, the dollar is 3 times more widely used internationally than the euro, to say nothing of the renminbi, which is in 5th place behind the yen and the pound. So I think that my best guess is that the dollar will continue to its share to depreciate slowly, decrease slowly, but not with the prospect of being surpassed by any of the other currencies within the next few decades.
So I think this feature of a stable store of value, it's something that maybe might come up during the Q&A, because one reason why, for instance, Bitcoin could hardly become a global reserve currency is because its value fluctuates too much. But so basically, based on what Jeffrey just said, there are no rivals at the moment for the dollar. But the greatest threat for the dollar itself might be represented by the United States and by the policies that are being implemented here. It's difficult to gain trust of international investors. It takes time, but you can easily lose it and quite quickly if you adopt the wrong policies. And you can think about rising public debt, political brinkmanship, or the weaponization of the dollar. Sticking to the weaponization of the dollar, what's the view in Beijing, and what is the government doing to safeguard the economy?
Sure. So thanks for having me. And I've learned a lot about the international financial system from working with Edo, actually, on a paper. You really need someone with depth of knowledge of China, as well as a depth of knowledge about how international finance works. So from the view of Beijing, and really the view of a lot of countries, right? So one of the most interesting things that Lula did in Brazil in his first 100 days as president was visit Beijing, and sign some currency swaps with the People's Bank of China. And there's a big view, I think, in the developing world writ large that that they don't want their international financial position to be subject to the strategic aims of the United States as it relates to geopolitics. And so leaving our own morals out of it and our politics out of it about, say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the comprehensive sanctions, and when we might talk about whether those things work in light of what's happening right now. But one interesting thing is, many countries are basically saying the United States is in the business of putting increasing conditions on the use of the dollar and using its control over both the dollar. And it gives, I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which it does give an exorbitant privilege in the sense of geopolitics for the country that is the primary reserve currency. One is that it can use the dollar to constrain the movements of other countries, or it can use the dollar obviously to impose widespread sanctions, comprehensive sanctions. But the second thing is it also gives insight and data into international financial transactions, right? So this kind of view of what is the line of sight that a geopolitical power has into how geopolitics and how currency is working globally, right? And just the fact that the United States dominates the SWIFT system and the global banking system also gives it a lot of intelligence about what other countries do. And so you see a lot of third-party countries right now. I say third party because they're neither China nor the US, nor Russia, right? Kind of bristling a little bit at, why should our food supply be subject to US geopolitical statecraft aims? And so China is certainly one of those countries, even though it's my view that China did not necessarily actually support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or at least the extent of it. But certainly, is happy to see a weakened Russia and a distracted United States, but is looking with a long view to what if they do this to us? And critically, I think Beijing has been in that mode for some time now, not just with financial sanctions, but also with technology. So if we think about Xi Jinping's early period, right, the rise of Made in China 2025, a lot of that was about how do we insulate ourselves in case the West weaponizes its control over supply chains and indeed financial networks to constrain our technological acquisitions or economic rise. The irony is that Xi Jinping put into motion a bunch of actions which then required basically the United States to indeed weaponize those supply chains. And so it's accelerated relative to what they wanted. So right now, and Edo in my paper and some other research I'm doing takes a deep look at how the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, as well as policymakers in China are thinking about China's financial system, which, in case you haven't read a newspaper in the last 3 years, is not exactly in a great position. So China's domestic financial system and also its security vis-a-vis the international global system might be arranged or configured given what we've seen with the use of sanctions. And so everyone's mind is going to Ukraine as an analogy for Taiwan. I'm happy to talk about why I think it's not a great analogy, but certainly the PBOC has been tasked with thinking through the research aspect of how might China protect itself. And what's very interesting, and we'll probably get to some of this, is that the conclusion is that they do need to protect themselves in terms of basic security and access to external resources. But there's no conclusion that they can obviate the potential danger of comprehensive sanctions in a reasonable time frame, which we might think of as the next 10 years, right? So there's no real world, echoing what Jeffrey said, there's no real world in which the renminbi displaces the dollar, or even that the People's Bank of China or policymakers within China want it to displace the US dollar. And the principal reason behind that, and then I'll stop because we'll probably talk more about this, is that it does require, as Edo and Jeffrey just said, deep and open and liquid financial markets, which China does not have and may not want. And it also requires a kind of surrender of sovereignty over one's financial policy and political economy that we have seen time and time again that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the PRC are unwilling to do. And what's been really interesting about reading some of these reports and speeches and thinking is that they say it pretty openly, that the dollar is a public goods regime, and that they acknowledge, for example, the Kindleberger trap, which many of you may be familiar with, the idea that a falling power is unable to provide the global public goods in terms of the financial system, and a rising power is unwilling to provide those goods. So they acknowledge that problem and nonetheless say, we can't provide this global public good because we're focused on financial stability at home. And so there's a mismatch, as Edo began with, a lot of heat, not a lot of light when people think about the kind of renminbi versus the dollar. Which is that the key finding I think we have is that Beijing shows absolutely no appetite for global currency dominance, just for global currency protection vis-a-vis their own aims. And those may not be entirely legible or clear. And so I'm happy to talk more about that. But the main finding really is that the PBOC knows how difficult this is and doesn't seem to have an appetite for it in the short or medium term.
Thanks a lot, Meg. Jeffrey, maybe going back to what you just said at the end of your previous intervention, you said that over the next decade or decades, the dollar is unlikely to be displaced. So how do you see the role of the dollar evolving in the next, let's say, 10 years between now and 2034?
Well, again, I think the dollar will retain its #1 position, that by these various measures, the share will probably continue to increase as it has since the turn of the century, or in a sense, since the end of Bretton Woods, with a bit of a recovery in the late 90s. And the major reason is what I said, that by the 3 criteria, and even aside from inertia, US's score is as high or higher. The one reason to have doubts about this is, as Meg said, that the abuse of exorbitant privilege no longer necessarily takes the form of excessive deficits, money creation, inflation, depreciation, which is what people thought it meant in past decades. And when it was the term exorbitant privilege was coined by Giscard d'Estaing, I think it's what he meant. But because the U.S. has used the dollar increasingly as part of sanctions, particularly financial sanctions, there is the view that countries like China and Russia will shift out of dollars. Anybody who thinks they might be a target of sanctions in the future, and to some extent it applies to the euro as well for European sanctions. And Russia, after the first time it invaded Ukraine, shifted heavily, basically got rid of almost all its dollars and shifted into renminbi and gold, and euros, other currencies. In retrospect, Putin was was planning way back then to possibly invade Ukraine, and he wanted to insulate them. And they built up the reserves pretty high. As it happened, the sanctions that the U.S. and the rest of the Western countries applied were pretty strong, more comprehensive than one might have guessed ahead of time. And Russia has lost access even to its non-dollar reserves if they're held abroad. But still, it means the question is meaningful. I don't dismiss it, whether extensive use of sanctions, and I don't really consider it abuse of my personal judgment in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But there's some other cases where I think the U.S. has abused it. In any case, if we use it very often, rightly or wrongly, it stands to reason that central banks and others will shift away from the dollar. So that is the one fly in the ointment, and the one reason to think it might decrease.
And if I may, going back to what Meg said, are you concerned about this Kindleberger trap?
So the Kindleberger trap, again, is Charlie Kindleberger, who was a professor of mine long ago at MIT. Suggested that the pound has, Britain after World War I had lost the ability to be the world hegemon, or the leader, the conductor of the orchestra, and the US had gained the ability in terms of size and power, but it wasn't yet thinking like a world leader. And that was what gave rise to all kinds of economic and political problems in the interwar period, which the Allies were determined to avoid. I met in Bretton Woods in 1944. I wonder about the phrasing. Will the U.S. lose the power, lose the economic ability or the power to exercise global leadership or hegemony? The reason why that phrasing no longer strikes me as quite apropos is that U.S., to the extent that policy is determined by one of the two political parties, since the turn of the century, has been throwing away leadership, global leadership, with both hands. So how do you apply the framework where countries want to have power, hegemony, and leadership, of which having your currency being the premier international currency is just one aspect? But how do you even accept that framework when on all other dimensions, the U.S. has been acting like we don't care, we don't want to be leaders anymore? And I'm, of course, particularly alluding to the possibility that Donald Trump might be elected president, in which case it's sort of the end of U.S. leadership, regardless, and the currency issue is sort of minor by comparison.
Thanks. I don't know if you want to elaborate on this or.
Yeah, I mean, I guess by mentioning the Kindleberger trap, I'm not sure whatever historian is in me buys into the idea that that was the source of all the problems in early 20th century geopolitical and economic history. But there is an interesting kind of corollary to it in political science, which some people may be familiar with, which is hegemonic stability theory, right? The idea that that global peace and prosperity, although imperfect, right, and totally unequal, sort of benefits from the provision of public goods, part of which is a provision of global security, which applies to some people more than others in the age of American imperium, and that apply and global financial stability. And so I would say the interesting thing right now is I think what we're seeing, and then this again is kind of in the political realm rather than just the financial realm. In the political realm, we're seeing all kinds of American allies all over the world, right, rearm themselves and prepare to defend themselves. I mean, we had, since I guess we all have tenure now, and Jeffrey already mentioned it, Trump saying a couple weeks ago, you better be prepared to defend yourself, and I'll encourage Russia to attack you. Then we have headlines in Europe, Edo, saying, Europeans thrilled that Germans are rearming themselves. Like, boy, that's very interesting. And so in the security realm, when you think about military security, we're certainly seeing everyone acting as if they're preparing for a future in which America does not provide those things. And so the financial, equivalent to that would be you act as if there's a future in which that you can't trust the dollar, either because of the brinksmanship or the weaponization, or kind of the debt dynamics and the fundamentals within the US economy. I tend to think in the financial realm, things are much stickier. And so it's much harder, just for kind of almost mechanical reasons that Jeffrey outlined, for countries to prepare for that future. But that preparation can be self-fulfilling, right? So once you start to prepare for that future, then you get, for example, in different countries, military industrial complexes that then, have certain vested interests, and then it's hard those things get entrenched in a way that it's hard to reverse that. And so I imagine that in the context of the global financial system, the biggest problem is that the fundamentals of the US economy are actually pretty good, right? And so I think in ways people aren't willing to, and you can't kind of insure yourself against global financial dynamics in the same way that you might through security issues. But there is, I think, something there about instability and the inability to provide those public goods.
And maybe you might fall into this Kindleberger trap if the global economy fragmented fragments into different economist block, and then you might not have a single currency that provides stability, and these blocks might not cooperate to provide financial stability globally. So that could be potentially a scenario.
Potentially, yes. So in our paper, as you know, we talk about kind of three scenarios. One is this continued kind of stable dollar dominance. One is a coexistence, which I think is much better than that. And the other is this kind of competitive block where you have bad countries using the renminbi, and then you have the good countries using the US dollar. And there are a bunch of reasons why I think that that's a really negative outcome, including for U.S. prosperity and national security. So if we push China to only use, and China and other countries only to use the U.S. dollar, we lose the deterrence effect of sanctions as well as the information collection effect of controlling the global financial system. And so that's a pretty unstable situation. But
yeah, if I may, if Jeffrey doesn't mind, I have a follow-up question for you, and related to what you were saying at the beginning when you were providing this China view. I think what's missing in the debate right now is really the China view. We are making in the West conjectures about what Beijing wants for the renminbi, but really few people knows what's going on right there. And you probably are one of those few people. I mean, at least you are following the debate more closely. You read the Chinese, you read official documents. So what does Beijing want for its currency? Because you can play a currency in the international monetary system can play different role. It can be used just to settling and invoicing trade transaction. It can be a secondary reserve currency like the Swiss franc or the Japanese yen, or it can be the leading reserve currency like the dollar. What does Beijing want for the renminbi?
So, my reading of what Beijing wants for the renminbi, which is both based on, yes, reading the documents and, talking to people when I can, but also of observing every action the CCP has taken every time there's any kind of international or domestic crisis, is it really wants absolute discretion over its own domestic economic system. That's been true for a long period of time. It's really the Asian financial crisis where the main finding on the part of the CCP was if you have capital controls, you are not subject to this kind of crazy contagion effect and the deleterious effects of hot money, portfolio flows. And then they kind of commit to that lesson over and over again throughout the 2000s. So even at the moment when China was expanding internationally with Belt and Road and doing a bunch of M&As across the world, the conclusion at that point when the renminbi joined the SDR in 2015, and then they liberalized the currency just a little bit, its value dropped significantly in a way I'm actually not sure if we know that the PBOC expected that. And partly because capital was flowing out of China quite rapidly at the time, for all kinds of reasons that weren't necessarily the wishes of the regime at all, right? So you had global multinationals pulling money out to do for all sorts of reasons, given, based on politics, based on economic fundamentals, et cetera, as well as, Chinese domestic businesses engaging in significant amounts of capital flight. And so then it was very interesting because in Beijing at the time, it switched from trying to suppress the renminbi to facilitate exports that they wanted, the currency manipulation that we heard about for decades and decades, to what was called, protect 3 trillion. So protecting 3 trillion in reserves in the PBOC in order to protect the value of the renminbi. They were worried about it dropping too quickly. And so so they show, based on their revealed preferences in economic terms, or what they actually do, that they prefer that domestic discretion and domestic financial stability over absolutely anything. And then in their talking, I would say the way that they think about it is really the most limited aim, the first one that you set forth, which is basically they want to be able to buy the things they need from the world in a way that disintermediates the United States if they have to. And so that means, natural resources, it means rare earths, it means technology. Those are the things that they've been very proactive in developing economic security plans in order to develop domestically, indigenously, or to find global partners such as Iran, right, such as Russia, such as certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are critical producers of some of these rare earths and minerals, where they do not have to worry about trading those things on open markets in a way that is subject to US economic sanctions. But they show no appetite for offshore trading of the renminbi. They show no appetite actually for lending in renminbi, right? All of the lending for the Belt and Road, for the vast majority, has been in US dollars. They show no appetite, right, for basically providing those public goods in various ways. And the flip side of that is that if you were a central banker sitting somewhere in the world, you would look at the way that they conduct policymaking in their own financial system, and you would conclude that their own domestic political and financial stability is always going to be paramount, and that may not exactly incentivize you to hold renminbi as a reserve currency, much less a premier reserve currency. So my assessment is that their aims are really quite limited.
Okay, and I think this is a key insight for the current debate, because I think most of the people believe something completely different. They expect, they think Beijing wants to replace and displace the dollar. But maybe we go back, we get back to that in a second.
Actually, can I just comment on that? I mean, I basically agree with what Meg said. I do think the Chinese government wanted to internationalize the renminbi in particular, and have the renminbi be adopted as part of the SDR, even though it didn't quite qualify according to the previous criteria, basically for reasons of prestige. And they eventually got the SDR status. But I think they gradually came to realize that to be internationalize the currency more widely would require continuing to liberalize capital controls. And as Meg said, they decided they don't want to do that because they want to retain control. And particularly, she also said, since 2014, the trend has been downward. The mid-2014 is when the renminbi peaked in value in foreign exchange terms, and it's when the Chinese reserves, PBOC reserves, peaked. And since then, all the pressure has been downward, and they're worried about too much pressure downward, so they've been intervening to slow it down, partly by foreign exchange intervention, especially during the first 2 years, but also by kind of reinstating or capital controls, or taking a pause in financial market liberalization.
So coming from Europe, even if the title doesn't mention it, I think it's unavoidable to spend a few words about the euro. So if we assume, as you said, that the role of the dollar might slowly and gradually decline over time, while remaining the premier reserve currency, what kind of role do you think can the euro play in the future?
Well, there was a time when I thought the euro might be eventually a serious rival for the dollar, and I actually made the mistake of writing a paper that said that it's a possibility in the title, and I've been teased about it ever since. But it was the statement. What the paper said was, if Britain and Sweden join, and other countries join the euro, so that it becomes larger than, or as large in economic size as the US. And if it includes London, and so the total financial markets rival the US, and if the US does do something about protecting the, reducing budget deficits and protecting the value of the dollar, then we had simulations. This is a paper joined with Menzi Chin that suggested that by 2020, the dollar might give way. But none of those conditions have been satisfied. And I kind of withdrew the implied prediction pretty quickly, even when the 2008, 2010, when the euro crisis hit. By then I had kind of withdrawn it. So you know, the euro is clearly the #2 currency, and what I think will continue to be that by the various measures. By the criterion of use in SWIFT payments, transactions currency, it's increased substantially. Still not close to the dollar, but closer than by the other measures. But as I said,
but do you think, and this is maybe for both of you, maybe the debate can be reframed differently? Instead of thinking of the yuan displacing the dollar, is it more likely that the yuan might displace the euro in the ranking?
Well, remember, it's only recently got #5. It clawed its way above the Australian dollar and the Canadian dollar to reach #5. It'd be reasonable to think it might pass Britain and Japan to reach #3.
But with that movement, if I may, because I'm curious about this too, because I do see, I mean, I was in Pakistan last summer, and you know, I do research on China's kind of international role and some of the countries in which it's deeply invested. is the data that show, right, that it's now clawed its way to number 5, do we know how much of that is coming from developed world use of the renminbi versus developing world use of the renminbi?
We can break a lot of it down. I don't.
Yeah, you don't know off the
from
top of
my
your head.
mind.
I mean, I wonder if a scenario would be, I mean, if indeed statistically, right, we see that kind of displacement, which I also find kind of far-fetched, but right, but if we see that it would really be this kind of emergence of, okay, Brazil and China, why shouldn't we trade finished goods and, from China with Brazil for raw materials in renminbi, right? Why shouldn't we settle it in renminbi? And so it's interesting because how globalized the currency really is versus, right, if it's kind of globalized in a limited scope of countries in which China's deeply macroeconomically enmeshed or developmentally enmeshed. That would be, I think, an interesting question.
Yeah, and I think as it is now, I think it's more consistent with this idea of regional blocks.
Right.
And before, I mean, I don't see any reasonable scenario at the moment where it can expand beyond that. But I have one more question, and then we can let the audience jump in. For you, Meg, in the paper, I mean, at the beginning, I said we would have not discussed the paper, and we ended up talking about it a lot. So
we
I
wrote
hope
down everything we thought about this topic in the paper, so reasonably.
So I hope you, the audience, finds it interesting. We make a controversial claim in the paper. We say that it is in the interest of the US to push for the internationalization of the yuan going forward. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. So our view is that it's basically a costless way of reassurance with China. So, so here's my, I am not an international relations scholar, but as everyone who studies China, I have become one by force over the last several years. And I do have some training, which I'm drawing back on quite deeply. But so, international relations scholars are consistently saying you can't really have effective deterrence without assurances, right? So if you're in a kind of security dilemma situation, which I think the US and China are in, right, where we definitely want to deter, say, an invasion of Taiwan. It's not my view that such a thing is imminent at all. So please don't think that what I'm saying is China is about to invade Taiwan. I do not have this view. Actually, I think it's wildly overemphasized in the United States right now. But in any case, we want to deter that, certainly, and that's a goal that we should have. And so, one way of deterring that, right, and so you can, if you're going to deter China from doing that, say militarily and financially, right, it only works if you reassure them that if they don't take that action, that those means won't be used, right? So if we threaten to sanction China or to refuse China's participation in the global political economy, and they think that that's going to happen regardless of what they do, then it doesn't matter what they do, and then the deterrence won't work. And so there are many arenas in which it's very difficult to cooperate with China and very difficult to ensure China's responsible stakeholdership, which is China's own language in the global system, right? So one is militarily, there's a whole question of how emerging emerging market sovereign debt might be resolved in the next 10, 20 years or so, right, given that China and the IMF and other countries have been at odds over whose debt gets priority and how those workups are going to happen. And that's a whole other subject that people may be interested in. But it's very interesting. So for example, with technology supply chains, with military issues, right, we don't have the means through which to verify that China is committing to the things it wants to we want it to commit to, right? Whereas the interesting thing with the global economy is that I think Xi Jinping would love for Chinese people to think that the reason the economy is doing badly is because America is trying to contain and suppress the Chinese economy, even though our political leaders are saying repeatedly in Beijing and outside Beijing, we want to see China rise. We're just concerned about de-risking, and I think that's a reasonable position to have. So what better way to rhetorically say we want your global participation and membership than in the international financial system, right? To say, look, the renminbi should have a global stake. You have a large economy. You have a very important global role as a global economic power. You should have a stake in the global economy. And the beauty of this as a reassurance is that we don't have to monitor it, right? There's no point at which Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken have to go and say, you didn't fulfill your commitments to liberalization because markets do it, right? So, so to say we invite renminbi internationalization is to show China that there are arenas in which they can participate, and the discipline function doesn't have to come from the US throwing its weight around. On the other side of it, if we do choose to throw a weight around about the use of the renminbi and go to Brazil and every other country that wants to create cross-border settlement mechanisms with China and say, don't use the renminbi, that seems to be an extraordinary waste of US global political capital and a signal to China that indeed the US is trying to contain and repress China. And the last thing I'll say about that, which we do write about in our paper, and here's where I'm better as a comparative political economist, is that there remains a contingent of policymakers in China that are still quite cosmopolitan and liberally minded. It's very interesting. Over the last 40 years, almost all of the people who have dominated the People's Bank of China have been Western trained and have, real personal reasons for wanting the esteem of people like Jeffrey and for wanting basically to see China play a global role and even wanting liberalization of China's domestic political system more function for the role of markets. There is an argument, I think, that empowering those people may, even though they are in a quite weak position right now, especially there's been a huge reconfiguration of China's financial market governance and that architecture that has sidelined those people and in fact even sidelined the People's Bank itself in favor of the Central Financial Commission that now governs the economy. But nonetheless, to say, look, we welcome internationalization. It empowers the people who are in charge of that, who may be the more liberal-minded people in China. I know I may sound like Bill Clinton in the 1990s, but part of, and I'll just end with this, but part of, the prompting for this paper that Edo and I produced is what's a reasonable but optimistic outcome for China in the next 10 years. And, as much as people may be unhappy with China's global economic role, it is a fact, right? And it must be dealt with as a fact rather than wishing for a world in which people didn't care what China and the CCP are doing anyway. They're a fact, they matter in the world. And then there are, I think, ways on the edges that we can engage in a more transactional relationship, and especially one where markets do the disciplining and it's not US, executive personnel that have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, the US should still play a role in the sense that in order for the yuan to be internationalized, you need to liberalize China's capital account.
Right.
And this implies a number of reforms that need to be undertaken. But at the same time, the liberalization of China's current capital account could be the equivalent of the opening of its current account 25 years ago. And to some extent can be also beneficial for the global economy in terms of stability and a number of other factors. I don't know if you, Jeffrey, you want to jump in, or we can open up the floor.
Let's open up the floor.
We have 2 questions in the front row.
Thank you all for coming today and for your remarks. I had a question largely for Professor Rithmire about how China's domestic economy plays into this narrative. So we heard yesterday at the 2 sessions that the CCP committed to 5% GDP growth and extensive government spending and stimulus, particularly to local governments, which are policies that seem to run counter for China's continued sustainable and stable growth. So how do you see the future of China's domestic economic situation and potential domestic economic instability playing into its international economic aims?
Yes. This is the topic of a whole other, set of issues, but it is the area I focus on most. It is relatively clear what China actually has to do from a policy standpoint, right, to fix some of what's going on in the Chinese economy, an over-reliance on real estate, land development for both household savings, wealth accumulation, as well as for local government, fiscal health and revenues. That's something I've been working on for a long period of time. And I'm actually kind of bored by it in the way that it's the same dance over and over again, where they say, and even Xi Jinping said over the last couple of years, yes, it's a tough moment of rebalancing and, trying to kind of act as if they've engineered a slowdown in order to rebalance the economy. And then they're going back into the same thing that they've done over and over again. And it's not necessarily through the real estate sector, but local governments, right, are going to spend that money in the investment channel. Whereas what the real, I'm not the macroeconomist here, but the real GDP growth that they need, right, is through consumption and through innovation rather than investments in kind of fixed assets that look more like infrastructure and buildings and less like, I guess, AI and other things, although they're doing a lot of that too, right? So, and domestic consumption, which they really need to shift to. And so this seems like a kind of same song, similar lyrics to me. And the really interesting thing, and this is all I'll say about it, is that the Leninist bureaucratic system is just not organized to do anything other than tell bureaucrats exactly what to achieve in terms of a numerical target. And so when it comes to something else, they're just not as good at getting things done, whether it's protecting the environment or figuring out where, you know, indigenous innovation comes from. They're just not good at the kind of decentralized level, right? The fragmented level at necessarily doing that. What is good at that is markets. Markets, I mean, you know, call me a capitalist, but like markets are pretty good at determining what the efficient allocation of capital might be. And so they have this kind of problem, and where the, you know, the things that it took them to get from a poor agrarian country to be an industrialized country that was export and investment driven, there's a whole nother set of things that they need to undertake to get them to the next thing. And I see basically no evidence of political will to, or even maybe even capacity to do that, but it's more opaque than it used to be in the past. You also asked about political instability. This is a huge unknown, and I don't know. I mean, my sense, having, you know, been in Beijing since the lifting of the COVID policies, is that people are pretty unhappy and pretty depressed. I mean, I certainly talk to, you know, some kinds of people more than others, and so that's not systematic, and we don't do surveys in China anymore, so we don't really know. But it does seem like, you know, a reasonable question might be, are Chinese people willing to sacrifice kind of a wrenching domestic deflation and, you know, the kind of economic contraction that almost looks like, I mean, not quite, but like a little bit of what the Greeks went through. I mean, it seems, are they willing to tolerate that and for how long? And I'm not sure we know the answer to that, but we only know that we're really surprised in China when things happen. Like everyone was pretty surprised with the COVID protests, right? And I guess we should position ourselves to not be super surprised if something dramatic happens in China over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And that may be a change in how Xi Jinping thinks and does things, a change in other things. I mean, I'm not saying there'll be a revolution in China, but the CCP itself changes course relatively quickly. And I know a lot of people who've been wrong about that. I'm unwilling to be. So I would just say embrace the uncertainty.
So I think there is a Paul Tucker, and we have a number. We try to arrive to everyone. Okay, maybe here.
Hi. Do you think the wholesale CBDC is going to help China in its goal to insulate itself from the economic sanctions? And the second question would be that we often look at the SWIFT monthly data, but there are a lot of trade settlements that are happening outside the SWIFT mechanism, especially Russia and China and Middle East. Do you think if you take into account that information, the China's position in the ranking is slightly different?
Yeah, so I mean, do I think it will insulate China from sanctions? My answer to that is no. Not the way the Chinese economy is currently configured. I mean, Russia, we could argue that the sanctions haven't really worked in Russia. There's a whole theory about what do you want sanctions to do? Do you want them to deter an action, or do you want them to diminish an action's, the replenishment force of a military once it's taken place? The Center for New American Security, CNAS, has put out a really good report on sanctions in Russia and how they've worked and not worked. And so I'm only getting things from that. But China's economy, just to put it very obviously, is much more diversified and globalized than Russia's has ever been. Okay, so in that sense, the kinds of sanctions that the US has put on Russia, if those were to happen in the Chinese economy, they would be absolutely catastrophic. And that is completely the conclusion of every PBOC employee who has done this, right? So will they be able to get raw materials? Yes, they're going to be able to get oil and rare earths because they've been very proactive about those supply chains and because of their relationship with Russia, Iran, and other places, right? But when you think about the ways in which, wealth is actually built in China, it would be much more catastrophic for China otherwise. The cross-border settlement, when you think about the kinds of inputs that China's economy would need in the future and whether they're willing to tolerate the kind of closed economy that the Russians have semi-tolerated over the last 2 years, I don't see that being a possibility in the short term.
So just not to give an advantage only to the people in the front row, can I see who wants to ask a question? Okay, maybe over there. Then we arrive to you.
Thank you, Professor. So I have a question. You both touch upon this, but I want to ask about the role of capital control going forward. So we know that one of the key differences between RMB and US dollar is the extensive use of capital controls in the case of China. But if we look at the criteria for opening up, it seems like China has fulfilled a lot of criteria, such as it's reaching the bottom line of high-income countries. It is open to trade. It has a lot of perspectives of opening up its financial account in the future. So I was wondering, I mean, I get that China is currently prioritizing its own political and societal stability, but at some point, I feel like the Chinese authority might want to liberalize its capital account going into the future. So I wonder at that point, when will that happen, number one? And number two, what are some considerations that the Chinese authority will consider at that point? Thank you.
Jeffrey want to?
I mean, liberalizing your financial account is something that countries tend to do as they become rich, sort of on average, roughly speaking. I guess maybe Korea is an example of a country that liberalized as it passed from being a developing country to a higher income country. Not as totally integrated into world financial markets as the biggest rich countries, but still. I just come back to what's been said, that at least under the current government, Xi Jinping wants to, above all else, retain political control, party control of the system, and that's more important to him than any of the economic or financial goals. And that means keeping the capital controls.
And I'll just say, in addition to that, those are very different political choices, right? So the ability to open to trade, especially, I mean, if you think about the terms of China's openness to trade, when you have a large domestic market and you can extract different bargains from international investors than other people might. How did they liberalize to to global trade, right? They did it through SEZs, a very contained geographically and policy, kind of mode of gradual experimentation. And so you can't really do that, right? It's not analogous to the financial account. You can't say, liberalize the financial account in Guangdong and then not, in the rest of the country. And so, and whenever they have moved to liberalization, I mean, this pattern that Jeffrey described, where they really did want to internationalize the renminbi, and there was political will to liberalize the capital account, and then they run up against the problems that it limits their own discretion. That's a typical pattern in Chinese policymaking that I think we've seen over and over again. Where they're unwilling to tolerate the instability and therefore pull back, right? And this is just a kind of qualitatively different beast. I mean, the last thing I would say about that is that, and if you look at China's external balances, but during the first two Xi Jinping terms, the amount of money, right? So China's, like, the amount of dollars leaving China in terms of China's outward foreign direct investment is almost the same as the money leaving in errors and omissions every year, right? So in a weird way, they have an extraordinarily leaky capital control system, right? And so, there's a lot of money getting out of China, as anyone who's trying to buy a home in Vancouver or frankly Cambridge, right, can testify. There's a lot of money coming out of China. And so the interesting thing is then, how do we see that in a different light? Well, a lot of people have made a big deal of, for example, the international, like the digital yuan, and, China is trying to make this bid for global currency dominance, or China's own domestic financial digitalization. But a lot of that may be the monitoring aspect, right? And so, I mean, if you can see all of the money changing hands on WeChat and Alipay, then the old bribes in the plastic bags, right, aren't as possible, and it's harder, right, to internationally expatriate assets, which is a real phenomenon in China. And so I just think we shouldn't see this as a logical next step, liberalizing the capital account. It's a very different beast than the steps that China's taken before.
So, and if I may, the internationalization of the yuan could actually help China to shift towards a consumption-driven growth model, because the easiest way to provide the rest of the world with your currency is to run a current account deficit, and this means that you need to reduce you need to boost your domestic consumption. So in a way, the two things are quite related, and it could be in the interest of China to make this move. But there is the problem of the instability that could emerge from the liberalization. There was someone in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk, Professor Rithmire and Professor Frankel, and thank you so much, Edoardo, for the moderating. So I want to touch upon again about digitalization, because there seems to be quite a fuss about digitalization, even including cryptos, maybe around 5 years before, and also the CBDCs have been mentioned. But I think right now the trend kind of being dying down, and we're going back to the original discussions about whether whether actually China even has the appetite of internationalization. And right now we can see India actually is pushing forward for its own digitalization transaction methods across the Southern Asia region, similarly to the buzzwords that came to China expanding to Southeast Asia in its international digital transaction system. I would like to seek, how do you see digitalization will kind of affect the trend or not affect the trend at all in terms of the dominant currency? Thank you so much.
Digitalization is important. India has done a lot over the last few years in terms of the tax system and transfer system and the whole financial system. So there's a role for digital currencies, and particularly CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. But I don't see it as a primary or even secondary determinant of whether a currency is a premier international currency. We already have digital currencies. You don't pay for most things even before Bitcoin or so on. We don't pay for most things in cash. We pay by bank accounts, check by check or bank draft. And that is part of digitalization, and I think that will continue. Whether central banks issue CBDCs, I mean, and China does seem to be in the lead on that, and the U.S. sort of behind, is an interesting question. It's an important question. It probably means the central bank taking over some of the functions of commercial banks, because you or I can't have a bank account at the Fed and write a check on it. So it is substantive, but I don't think the banking industry would appreciate the competition too much. And I think the issue is largely orthogonal from the international currency issue.
Do you want to jump in? So we have a question here. Who else wants to ask a question besides Paul? We have another one. Okay.
Glad to see my students asking a lot of questions.
So China has always wanted to shift from an export-driven economy to a consumption-driven one. So do you think a fixed and artificially undervalued yuan has prevented that transition? And if they really think, so what do you think, what has driven this fear of floating of Chinese government?
So I don't know if I would blame the international currency position for that, but it is related to capital account liberalization. So look, the institutions in China, and I respond to this question about what's going on with the Chinese economy. A piece of that is the fiscal piece, right? There's a set of fiscal problems. A piece of that is the financial piece, and a piece of it is, Chinese household savings are extraordinarily high. China is basically, it's financial repressions. There are limited outlets for appreciation of those household values. And so especially stock markets in China are limited, and Chinese households can't easily invest in stock markets of the rest of the world and see their assets appreciate, nor can international investors easily, right, invest in Chinese markets, right, to allocate that capital efficiently or to, aid those markets in growing. So why are people not consuming? They're politically insecure. They don't know about the future. China's demographic issue means that one person in the workforce is paying for has the prospect of paying for every 6 retirees, and there's no financial solution to that, right? So how am I dealing with my retirement and my mother's retirement? I'm saving, and Harvard's saving on my behalf, and I hope that markets are going to appreciate my savings, whereas, Chinese households, they buy houses, and they hope that those houses increase in value. And so basically that shift to consumption, that's really, I want people to understand it's a political shift, because people have to feel better about the future. Americans may feel too good about the future with our levels of spending, right, and our lack of savings. And I think Jeffrey's right, we may not feel that great about the future, whereas Chinese households are extraordinarily pessimistic, I think, for economic structural reasons as well as for political reasons. And so nothing I see them doing right now is helping, with those particular issues. And so what does it get, to get a consumption? You really also need kind of a domestic financial system that's going to be modern, that people can trust. No one trusts China's domestic equity system, and they shouldn't, right? Because the government intervenes every time the asset shares start to slide. They'd be better off if they just let the assets actually markets work, and then people would say, okay, next time they're going to let markets work, and I trust it. Instead, they fire the guy who's in charge of the securities exchange. Like, why would anyone, is that his job performance to make the securities appreciate? It's wild, right? And so we just see no embrace of markets in that way in China. And I think that makes the consumption problem even worse.
Do you want to say?
Well, just briefly, I think that the Chinese government, China did build its success on export-driven growth to some extent, and an undervalued renminbi was part of that, and that much is true. In the period up to, well, let's say from 2003 to 2010, I think the renminbi was undervalued, but it appreciated a lot. And by 2014, 15, I would say it was overvalued. Maybe again, it's getting down close to being undervalued. I don't know if that was part of what you had in mind. And similarly, well, so that's the currency. And as far as consumption, I mean, like the desire to see the renminbi internationalized, the leadership has for some time said we need to shift emphasis to consumption, but they haven't really done it. Or haven't taken steps to accelerate that. So I'm not sure from revealed preference, to use that term, I'm not sure that that's what they really want.
And if I can go back to what you just said, it's a political problem. It's also a social problem, in the sense that the savings rate in China is close to 35%, I think.
Household saving rate.
Household savings rate.
And the total saving rate, including companies, is much higher.
And so household savings rate is 35%. In the US, I think it's 5% at the moment, or even less. In the Eurozone, it's around 15%. So bringing it down from 35% towards, let's say, the Eurozone level, that is more reasonable than the American one, takes time. So even if there is the political will, people completely need to change their consumption habits. So I don't think it's something that can happen quickly.
No, and it requires also, I mean, there's been this big thing where everyone thinks Xi Jinping is a communist ideologue. Well, a communist ideologue would do something about social welfare and inequality, right? Yeah. So, I mean, the number one thing that would really help household savings rates in China go down and consumption go up is if there were a pension system that made sense, as if there were an unemployment insurance system that made sense, or a health insurance system that made sense. And so as a result, right, there's an inability to execute those things. And I'm not sure, I mean, I have a bunch of views on what's holding them up, but that's a key part of that. And that would be I would say, a prerequisite to the cultural change that would get you to stop saving.
Thank you very much. This has been great, and I love it that the discussions of currencies are put in an international relations setting. But I would say that because I've got a book out about it. There are two things I want to challenge. When you discuss, it's not that I disagree with anything particularly you said, but the time horizon seems quite short. And it's not that it seems quite short sitting in Harvard. It actually seems quite short for a policymaker. So my time horizon would be about 25 years. I think in units of 25 years. And if you think over that period, is it more likely or less likely that China is going to be a lot bigger and a lot more powerful over, say, a quarter of a century? I'd suggest that it's more likely that China's going to be a lot bigger and a lot more powerful over a quarter of a century, and that will create some gravitational pull to its currency, probably particularly in its own region. But it also means that debates about what does China want, and there are people in the government department that have written papers about this, and I just think they're rather peculiar, which is emerging powers, United States in the interwar years in the 20th century, they didn't know what they wanted to be. They couldn't imagine being as powerful as they found themselves, really from 1943 onwards. And even though leader Xi will carry on for quite a long time, I'm very keen on carrying on for a very, very long time. Even he can't imagine what China is going to want when it is even bigger. And I think this bears on the Kindleberger thing as well. First of all, we haven't got many observations of this. Kindleberger concentrates on one, the decline of my country and the rise of yours. But your country was paralyzed partly because, apart from Benjamin Strong, it had a very immature central bank at the time. And a very complicated political system. I would rate the People's Bank's sophistication now way ahead of the Fed minus Strong in 1925 or something like that. And I would guess that their political system is in some circumstances capable of switching tack much more readily than the US system could do in the interwar years. We saw that with Roosevelt during the Second World War. But the other thing is, everything you've said about weakness of China right now seems kind of right. But what about the weakness here? Quite apart from insurrections and tension around the election, which either side could resist. I would put a non-zero probability on violent conflict towards the end of this year or beginning of next year. But even without all of that stuff, last year, Congress flirted again with hitting the debt ceiling. And if it does, I'm really confident that would have been, I once upon a time, I kind of helped make reserve decisions and mark down dollars a little bit, mark up euros a little bit. Jeffrey's prediction, the mistake you made was to put a time on it. Actually, as a qualitative description, they've got a better record with inflation than the Fed. Notwithstanding all of their difficulties, they may have more political stability than this country. And my point isn't that those are hard predictions. It's that as people around the world are making their choices, it will depend not only on whether China's in difficulty, but on whether this place is in difficulty and how it maintains its friendships around the world. My question is, are those outrageous comments?
So first, let me answer on two technicalities, if I can. You want to go ahead?
No, if I may, we have 7 more minutes, so I would ask you and Jeffrey to be concise, and we try to collect a couple of more questions. Okay.
Should I ask mine then? Or
okay, since you have a microphone, okay, go
okay.
ahead. Yeah, in the interest of time, it can be helpful.
Okay, yeah, my question is the role of the Hong Kong dollar, because I'm actually surprised that hasn't come up, and how Chinese markets, they need access to IPOs in Hong Kong, to list and, to make revenue through the Hong Kong economy. So I'm curious, what you guys see for the role of that. Is there gonna be more reliance for Chinese companies to access Hong Kong, or do you see that, decreasing over time or something like that? So that's my question.
So Jeffrey and Meg, you.
Jeffrey.
I think China is killing Hong Kong on the long horizon as a leading financial sector. I have a little story to tell when we're done, on the finishing note. Should I do it now?
Yeah, you can do it.
Well, it's just that Paul Tucker said the time horizon, you need to think of a longer time horizon. So my story is 2004, when China first started being criticized for keeping the renminbi unfairly undervalued. And I participated in a conference at the PBOC, and we talked about the pros and cons of fixed versus floating exchange rates. And Bob Adele was there, and they ate up what he had to say about fixed exchange rates, because they didn't want to appreciate the renminbi. They didn't want to move towards floating. At the end, a deputy governor of the central bank summed up what he said he had learned from the previous 2 days, and he said, "I think that in the long run we will move towards a floating exchange rate, but you have to realize China is 6,000 years old. So when I say the long run, this could be 200 years."
I'll say. I'm going to say something similar without the flair, except for I'm answering on a technicality. So on the U.S., we write about this, but I'm no specialist on the U.S. I'm just a mom and a voter, and all I can say is, yeah, I'm as worried as you are. And really, in a weird way, you're only as good as you're only as attractive as a second best currency, as the first currency is unattractive. And if it becomes wildly unattractive, and Xi Jinping seems somewhat responsible, anything could happen. My other technicality is that our task for Carnegie was to answer the question for 10 years. But if it were 25 years or even 50 years, I would agree with you. The only thing I would say is they're not going to get to the path they're on now. So if you think, it's time and they're going to get here and they're going to go that way, there's going to be a juncture. And you might think of it as a similar juncture as the one where, Mao and Deng basically wanted the same thing. They just chose different means to get there. And so I would say in my lifetime, I'm going to see a radical change in China, not necessarily like a different political system or something, but a different orientation of the CCP, right? Xi Jinping in his current iteration of whoever he is not going to get China to the place where, that it's very strong and powerful. And so I'm not discounting a change or a success, but I'm saying that's what we should be looking for, change in the policy measures. Like, to me, like day-to-day SWIFT data and even, annual counting, it's the qualitative changes in the policies that we need to look for, and we know what we need to see.
So Tim Assad, very concise, John Haig, and then to wrap up.
Quick question, just going back to the digital yuan. One of the things, as you know, they are doing is the M-Bridge project with Hong Kong and Thailand and the UAE. If you say that, look, they're not really willing to do what it takes to internationalize the currency at this point, do you regard that as simply, look, let's export our CBDC technology as much as possible and kind of lay a foundation for the future use, or do you see other things they're trying to do with that?
Experimental. That's what they do with everything. They're experimenting just a little bit, right? In places where, frankly, with all respect to that group of countries, it's low stakes.
John?
We'll overlay. We had a talk the other day from Dan Rosen, and he gave us, economic statistics about China. And a lot of the discussion feels to me like a presumption that the lack of growth now is an anomaly and that it'll return to a structure of growth that's more in line with what it's been in the last 10 years. But when I listened to Dan, he was like, the official statistics are that 2023 was 5.2% economic growth. Their estimate is that it was really 1.5%, and that in fact that may be optimistic. And Larry Summers and Lant Pritchett wrote a few years back an article called it was about China's reversion to the mean.
Asiaphoria.
Asiaphoria, reversion to the mean. And if we assume that China, I might disagree with Paul a little bit. They're going to get bigger. Are they going to get bigger at the rate they've been getting big? Absolutely not, in my view. And I think we're looking at, like, if they're at 1.5%, it's slightly different. But the point is, how does that affect kind of their participation in the global monetary system, if at all? And does it change the dynamic in some way that we're not thinking about at the moment? So
we literally have 60 seconds, so 30 seconds for you, 30 seconds for you.
I think the Chinese slowdown is long lasting. I don't think they ever were going to continue to grow at double-digit levels for the extra decade. And size of the Chinese workforce is already going down. So I radically shifted. I never thought they would catch up with the U.S. very soon, but I thought they would catch up in 10 or 15 years. And now I don't know that they will.
I would just say the political effects of 1.5% for a long period of time are not going to be good. So I don't think that's sustainable politically. And so we will see some change. Yes, 8%, 10%, no one ever thought, if you think they're going to continue to grow like that forever, that's a ridiculous assumption, right? So, but it's not Japan in 1989 in the sense that they still have a lot of room to grow. 300 million people in the countryside, right? They have a lot of room to grow. It just takes policy changes, and we'll know them when we see them. But it would take a change.
So I want to thank everyone for showing up. I want to thank Jeffrey and Meg for coming. Big thank you also to Victoria and Claire, because these events would not exist without them. So I wish you a nice rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.